Welcome to this tutorial on Talal Asad, an American anthropologist located in New York. We are interested in his theory of religion. We have already presented a video on Asad, on his theory of religion, but having just read through the original essay several times, I felt that a few key concepts needed a bit more articulation. So that's the reason that we are releasing a second version on Talal Asad. So, to begin with, Asad notices that Western scholars have often compared Christianity and Islam and viewed these religions as historical configurations of power and belief. Although Asad has nothing in principle against making comparisons between religious traditions, he does argue that these Western anthropological views have been flawed. For example, he takes issue with the fact that Western anthropological views have confined Christianity to Europe and Islam to the Middle East. He feels that confining these religions in that way neglects other important traditions. So if we confine Christianity to Europe, we seem to neglect Eastern Christianity that we also know are indigenous to the Middle East. Asad also objects to the connections made between religion and power, at least in the comparison that Western anthropologists have drawn between Christianity and Islam. Anthropologists have often viewed these connections as being different between Christianity and Islam, which Asad claims is a flawed comparison and that negatively impacts conceptualizations of Islam. He objects to the notion that Christian practice and discourse in history have been less concerned with the uses of political power for religious persons than the practice and discourse of Muslims. They have both been concerned with the use of political power. This representation of Islam, in his view of a fusion of religion with power, is an unjustified generalization. Asad also wants anthropologists to take into account differences rather than parallels between traditions in order to engage in a systematic exploration of traditions. In other words, one might ask questions as to how traditions differ and how they might change. One might wish to determine what connections there are between traditions, and so on. This approach, Asad believes, acknowledges that Islam is not a predetermined story or the product of an essential social structure. Moving on, one of the major facets of Western anthropology of Islam that Asad criticizes is the notion of a dual typology. This is an anthropology that depicts Islam as according to a classical social structure that consists of tribesmen and city dwellers. Depicting Islam according to this classical social structure has been an attempt for Western scholars to account for Islam's diversity. They do so by reducing Islam's diversity to these representatives of two major forms of religion. You have, on the one hand, the tribesmen, typically seen as holding to a saint-worshipping and ritualistic religion found in the countryside. The religion of the city dwellers, on the other hand, is viewed as a scripturalist and puritanical faith and a religion based on the Holy Book. This is a representation of an unchanging dualistic structure of Islam promoted by some anthropologists, and that has been assumed when making comparisons between Islam and Christianity. But this makes representations of Islam flawed, and it is through this that comparisons are being made. So Asad is basically arguing that these views are presenting two incompatible constructions of Islam. Islam seems to object to any notion that we can reduce Islam to these two constructions, because the Middle East contains many histories and social structures that overlap in space and time. As Asad explains in his own words, quote, "This typology rests on false conceptual oppositions and equivalences, which often lead writers into making ill-founded assertions about motives, meanings, and effects relating to religion." The reality of diversity nonetheless needs to be embraced despite the attractiveness of viewing traditions as homogeneous. There has been an incredible variety of traditional Muslim practices across different times, places, and populations. Asad uses the example of doing fieldwork with pastoral nomads as an example of diversity. He deduces that any assumptions made about the pastoral nomads in the Muslim Middle East having a typical political and economic structure is mistaken. Asad argues that there are no so-called typical tribes or nomads. Rather, there is a diversity in many areas, such as across formal constitution, socio-economic arrangements, politics, trade, and so on. Asad is arguing that any anthropology of Islam must account for diversity of a religious tradition. Asad also notices how any anthropological presentation of Islam will also depend on how one defines religion. He acknowledges that there have been difficulties involved in producing a conception of religion that is adequate for cross-cultural purposes. But he maintains that definition remains important because one's conception of religion determines the kinds of questions one will ask and what questions one believes are worth asking. These efforts have led some scholars to engage with historical sociological theorists like Emil Durkheim, Karl Marx, Max Weber, and others, and to use their ideas to describe forms of Islam. But as Asad argues, the result is not always consistent because some scholars mistakenly ascribe the theories of these thinkers to different actors within the Islamic tradition. For example, some scholars have taken Islamic tribal religion and viewed it through a Durkheimian lens, whereas others have taken the Islam of the urban dwellers and viewed it through the perspective of Karl Marx. What this does is to render Islam a mishmash of concepts of religion pulled into one representation. Asad then moves on to viewing Islam as a tradition. He argues that finding an adequate concept of tradition will assist anthropologists in studying Islam. According to Asad, a tradition consists of discourses that instruct practitioners regarding the correct form and purpose of a given practice that has a history. These discourses relate conceptually to a past, future, and present. The past looks at when a practice was instituted and from which the knowledge of its point and proper performance has been transmitted. The future looks at how a practice can be secured in the short or long term, or why it should be modified or abandoned. The present looks at how a practice is linked to other practices, institutions, and social conditions. In Asad's own words, Islamic discursive tradition is a tradition of Muslim discourse that addresses itself to conceptions of the Islamic past and future, with reference to a particular Islamic practice in the present. We can take the example of daily prayers. We might look at daily prayers as being a part of Islam's discursive tradition. We could ask such questions as to when this practice was instituted, and when did the notion of its proper performance begin to be transmitted? How strong is this practice in the present? What might it look like in the short or long-term future? What are the chances that it will be changed or abandoned? How does the ritual of daily prayer connect to other practices, institutions, and social conditions in the Islamic tradition? We find, for instance, that Muslims come together to say these prayers in the mosque and that they face in the direction of the Kaaba. The prayers also involve rituals like prostration, bows, and the reading from the Quran. According to Asad, a practice is Islamic because it is authorized by the discursive traditions of Islam and is so taught to Muslims by members of the tradition. We now move to the notion of actors. Asad believes we need to consider actors in a tradition. Any anthropology of Islam must be all-encompassing in how it considers various actors and protagonists. In Islam, for example, protagonists and actors may include tribal groups, nomads, merchants, literate clerics, saints, religious reformers, pastoral warriors, the poor, and so on. It is important to include all actors in the tradition across areas of age, gender, and knowledge. We are not only interested in the views of scholars or imams, but also in the views of ordinary Muslims, peasants, and those who are uneducated. Actors are those who speak, think, use language and texts. Important to them are foundational texts like the Quran, the Hadith, and heuristic commentaries. Actors negotiate, discuss, debate, and use reason when accessing these texts. Taking actors into account is essential to any anthropology of Islam. Another important component to any anthropology of Islam is the notion of power. Asad believes that power needs to be taken into consideration. He writes or argues, where there is religious orthodoxy, there is power, and that orthodoxy is crucial to all forms of Islamic tradition. Orthodoxy is not merely a body of opinion, but a distinctive relationship of power to truth, a view that Asad finds neglected in Western anthropologies of Islam. He believes that wherever Muslims have the power to regulate, uphold, require, or just correct practices, and to condemn, exclude, undermine, or replace incorrect ones, there is the domain of orthodoxy. Evaluating power means that the anthropologist must take into consideration what makes power possible socially, politically, and economically. One must consider the resistances to power that Muslims and non-Muslims might encounter. One might ask questions, are there internal conflicts between Muslim and non-Muslim communities? How are the dominant figures in the tradition being resisted? And so on. We must also take into account power relations through which truth is established. This leads the anthropologist to engage the dynamics of hierarchy, age, gender, and knowledge in the tradition. Furthermore, arguments and reasoning are also important dimensions to viewing religious traditions as discursive traditions. Western anthropologists have often marginalized the place of argument and reasoning surrounding traditional practices. Reason and argument are necessarily involved in a traditional practice whenever people have to be taught about the proper performance of practice. Reason and argument are used when teachings meet doubt, indifference, or lack of understanding. Reason uses debate, confrontation, and polemic as a process to win someone over for the willing performance of a traditional practice. It should be the anthropologist's first task to describe and analyze the kinds of reasoning and the reasons for arguing that underlie Islamic traditional practices. Having noted this, we can move into some summaries of how Talal Asad believes we should study religious traditions. First, any anthropology of Islam must avoid reductionist representations of traditions, like we saw in the Dual Typology. Rather, we must acknowledge the diversity that constitutes a religious tradition. Further, an anthropology of Islam needs to look at Islam as an instituted practice set in a particular context, and that has a particular history into which Muslims are inducted as Muslims. In other words, we must take into account the traditions, institutions that uphold Islamic practice. We need to also consider the context in which Muslims practice their religion. We also need to have an awareness of the history of a religious practice. Third, we must understand the historical conditions that enable the production and maintenance of specific discursive traditions, or their transformation and the efforts of practitioners to achieve coherence. We might want to ask, how is the tradition being preserved, and by whom is it being preserved? How are Muslims trying to achieve and sustain a coherent religious worldview? Fourthly, anthropologists must describe and analyze the kinds of reasoning underlying Islamic practices. Fifth, evaluating power means that the anthropologists must take into consideration what makes power possible, socially, politically, and economically. Sixth, and finally, the varieties of actors within the Islamic tradition must be taken into account when producing an anthropology of Islam.